The air around Mount Kifaru was always heavy with stories. The mountain loomed over the village of Ngoma, its jagged peaks scraping the heavens, cloaked in swirling mist that the elders claimed was the breath of the ancestors. To the people of Ngoma, the mountain was a judge, silent but omnipresent, watching over their deeds with impartial eyes. Every crack in its rocks, every rustle of the wind that descended from its slopes was a message from the spirits. At the break of dawn, the village stirred to life. Mud-thatched huts lined narrow dirt paths. Children scurried after goats, and the sweet, smoky scent of roasted maize filled the air. Yet, despite the lively hum, an unspoken tension bound the villagers. It was a place of whispers and belief, where the old ways dictated the rhythms of life, and fear of the unknown knitted suspicion into the hearts of many. Nyahera lived at the farthest edge of Ngoma, where the village met the dense forest. Her home, a modest weathered hut with peeling reeds, stood alone like its owner, quiet, withdrawn, and shrouded in mystery. Her days were spent tending to a small garden and feeding the wild animals that visited her home, creatures others deemed untamable, but which she welcomed with gentle hands. Every morning, Nyahera made her way to the river Wanja, its waters said to carry the blessings of the mountain. Her figure, wrapped in faded cloth, moved like a shadow along the village's edge. Women paused their work to watch her, shaking their heads in hushed disapproval. "She speaks to the forest like one of the spirits," murmured one. "And she never stays to greet us," added another, the faintest edge of fear in her voice. Rumors swirled like smoke. Nyahera's family had once been powerful, respected leaders in Ngoma, until betrayal brought them to ruin. Now, the villagers whispered, she kept something under her bed, something that held the weight of her family's curse. In the heart of the village, Omari sat in the chief's courtyard, his jaw tight as he watched Nyahera pass by from a distance. He was a striking man with sharp features and an air of authority, yet his eyes held a glint of dissatisfaction. "She thinks herself untouchable," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Omari's ambition burned brighter than the sun. Over Ngoma, he saw Nyahera's isolation not as misfortune, but as an opportunity. The whispers about her secret intrigued him, not out of fear, but greed. If he could uncover what she hid, perhaps he could harness its power, or wealth, and rise above his father's shadow. "Omari," the chief's deep voice called, snapping him out of his thoughts. A true leader must act for his people, not himself. Omari nodded, but said nothing. His father's words often fell on deaf ears. The only person who visited Nyahera willingly was Grandmother Mara, an elder with a face as lined as the bark of an ancient baobab. Mara was a bridge between the living and the ancestors, her wisdom rooted in stories carried through generations. She arrived at Nyahera's hut one evening, leaning on her carved walking stick. Nyahera welcomed her inside, offering her a simple meal of roasted yams. "Your troubled child," Mara said, her voice soft but knowing. Nyahera hesitated, her gaze drifting to the corner of the hut where the wooden box lay hidden beneath her bed. She sighed, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. "The whispers grow louder, grandmother. They would not understand why I got it." Mara reached for her hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Secrets have power, Nyahera, but they can also be chains. Remember the tale of the boy who hid the moon's light in a calabash. He thought he was protecting it, but it consumed him instead." Nyahera nodded, though her eyes lingered on the hidden box. Her expression conflicted. As night fell, the villagers' whispers grew into speculation. each rumor adding another layer of fear and curiosity. The villagers imagined all sorts of horrors. Beneath Nyahera's bed, a cursed treasure, a talisman of dark power, or the remains of her family's betrayal. Omari stoked these fears, his voice carrying authority and cunning. She guards something dangerous, he told a group of men gathered around a flickering fire. Something that could destroy us all if left unchecked. The men murmured their agreement, their trust in Omari outweighing their doubts. Inside her hut, Nyahera lit a single candle, its light casting flickering shadows on the walls. She knelt by her bed, pulling the box halfway into view. It was heavy, carved with ancient symbols that seemed to dance in the candlelight. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the box. Her voice, soft and filled with anguish, broke the silence. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. The wind outside howled, rattling the walls as if the spirits themselves echoed her words. The fields around Ngoma lay dry and brittle under the relentless sun, the soil cracking like the lips of a thirsty elder. The villagers gathered in small groups, their brows knit with worry as they spoke in hushed tones. The once bountiful harvests had dwindled, and the air seemed heavy with more than just heat. Omari moved among them like a shadow, his voice smooth as the river's current, but carrying the weight of his hidden agenda. "We were never like this before," he murmured to a group of farmers sharpening their tools. Not until she came back. The farmers exchanged glances. "Nyahera?" one of them whispered, hesitant. Omari nodded gravely. Her family brought shame to this village, did they not? Her presence stirs the spirit's anger. And what of the strange rituals she performs? You've seen the way she walks alone, speaking to no one, as if above us all. The men muttered amongst themselves, Omari's words seeding doubt like weeds in fertile soil. "What if he's right?" one of them asked, his voice trembling. "What if her family's curse is upon us now?" Omari leaned in closer, his tone urgent. "It is not a question of if. It is a question of how long we can endure her curse before the spirits punish us all." Nyahera sat in the shade of a tall acacia tree, her knees drawn to her chest as she stared at the river beyond. A cool breeze brought little comfort, for the weight of the villagers' stares hung heavy on her shoulders. She had seen them in the market earlier, their eyes lingering too long, their whispers cutting like thorns. "Nyahera," a voice called, smooth and deliberate. She turned to see Omari approaching, his tall frame outlined by the sunlight. He smiled, but it was a predator's smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard what they say about you," he began, sitting beside her uninvited. "The rumors, they are cruel, but I can help you." Nyahera's gaze did not falter. "Help me?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with suspicion. "Yes," Omari said, leaning closer. "I could silence them, protect you from their ignorance, but only if you allow me to stand by your side. As your husband." Nyahera's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the gentle woman who fed wild animals seemed replaced by something fiercer, sharper. "I see through you, Omari," she said, her words cutting like a blade. "You do not wish to protect me. You seek what you think I hide." Omari's smile faltered, his pride bruised. "Be careful with your words, Nyahera," he said, his voice low with warning. "The villagers' patience is not endless. When they come for you, do not forget who offered you a way out." She stood and looked down at him. "I do not fear you, Omari, and I will not bow to your greed." With that, she walked away, leaving him sitting in the shadow of the tree, his fists clenched and his heart burning with resentment. Omari's rejection festered like an open wound, driving him to action. He spent his nights speaking to the villagers, each word carefully chosen to stoke their fears. "You've heard the stories of her father, have you not?" he would say, his voice dripping with conviction. "He stole from the ancestors, defiled sacred ground, and brought ruin upon his own family. Do you think his blood would carry any less darkness?" The villagers, desperate to explain their suffering, clung to his words. "But what can we do?" one of the women asked, her voice trembling. "She keeps to herself. What if we are wrong?" Omari smiled. "Then let her prove it. Let her show us what lies under her bed. If she has nothing to hide, why does she guard it so closely?" The whispers became a roar, spreading through the village like wildfire. By the next day, even the elders debated the matter, their wisdom clouded by the villagers' growing fear. The quiet of her heart, Nyahera knelt beside the wooden box hidden beneath her bed. The symbols carved into its surface seemed to glow faintly in the flickering light of her candle. Her hands trembled as she traced the patterns, her lips moving in a soft, desperate prayer. "Great ancestors," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "I have kept your burden as I was told, but the villagers, they grow restless. I do not know how much longer I can protect this." Her words were met with silence, but the wind outside howled as if in answer. Nyahera bowed her head, her tears falling onto the rough wooden floor. The villagers' whispers reached Grandmother Mara, who shuffled through the marketplace, with her walking stick tapping against the ground. She listened but said little, her sharp eyes taking in the fear and anger around her. That evening, she made her way to Nyahera's hut, where she found the young woman sitting by the fire, her face pale and weary. "Grandmother," Nyahera said, rising to greet her, "you shouldn't be here. The villagers—" Mara waved her off. "Let them talk. Their fear blinds them, but it cannot blind me." She sat beside Nyahera, her voice soft but firm. "Child, I see the burden you carry, but burdens are not meant to be carried alone." Nyahera looked away, her hands wringing in her lap. "If I tell them the truth, they will destroy it. They do not understand." Mara placed a hand on hers. "There is a tale I must share with you," she said, her voice heavy with meaning, "of a boy who thought he could protect the moonlight by hiding it in a calabash. But when the calabash broke, it did not just spill light, it burned his hands, his home, and everything he loved. Sometimes what we think is protection becomes destruction." Nyahera listened, her heart heavy. Ma'ara's words stayed with her long after the elder had left, echoing in the stillness of the night. Omari, emboldened by the villagers' growing anger, called for a meeting in the chief's courtyard. The flames of the central fire danced in his eyes as he addressed the crowd. "We cannot wait any longer," he declared. "Every day we let her live among us, we risk the wrath of the spirits. If she will not reveal her secret, we must take it ourselves." The crowd murmured in agreement, their fear outweighing their doubts. The elders, though hesitant, gave their reluctant approval as the villagers gathered torches and tools. Nyahera stood in her hut, staring at the wooden box. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of her responsibility. Her whispered words barely audible over the howling wind. They wouldn't understand. Not yet. The flames of the villagers' torches drew closer, their shadows stretching long. Under the moonlight, the reckoning had begun. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtered through the thick canopy of clouds. The village of Ngoma was alive with restless murmurs, as shadows danced on the walls of mud-thatched huts. Torches flickered in the hands of the villagers, their faces painted with fear and determination. At their front stood Omari, his shoulders squared, his voice a rallying cry. "She has cursed us all," he bellowed, the firelight reflecting in his ambitious eyes. The ancestors' wrath is upon us because of her greed, her lies, and her family's betrayal. We must end this now, or Ngoma will be lost." The villagers, clutching farming tools and sticks, shuffled forward hesitantly. Their fear of the unknown was outweighed only by their desperation. Children clung to their mothers. Elders stood on the edges of the crowd, shaking their heads, but saying nothing. As they approached Nyahera's solitary hut at the edge of the forest, the sound of crickets was drowned by the rising chant of the crowd. But when they reached the door, silence fell. Nyahera stepped out, her face calm but firm, her eyes holding the weight of centuries. "Turn back," she said, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "Do not awaken what you do not understand." Omari pushed forward, his lips curling into a sneer. "Enough of your riddles, Nyahera. You hide behind your silence. But tonight, the truth will be revealed." He gestured for the villagers to follow, and they surged forward, ignoring her final warning as the door to her sanctuary was broken open. Inside, the air was heavy and still, as though the hut itself was holding its breath. The villagers entered, cautiously, their torchlight illuminating the modest room. Nyahera stood by her bed, her posture unyielding, her shadow long and unbroken against the walls. "It is under the bed," Omari said, pointing. "Drag it out." Two men stepped forward, hesitating for a moment before crouching to reach beneath the wooden frame. Their hands found something solid and heavy, and with a grunt, they pulled it into the light. Gasps rippled through the room as the object came into view. The wooden box was larger than they had imagined, its surface darkened with age and carved, with intricate symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the firelight. The older villagers stepped back in fear, their eyes wide with recognition. This is no ordinary box," an elder whispered. "These carvings, they are the marks of the ancestors." Omari scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Stories to frighten children. It is nothing but superstition." He turned to the men holding the box. "Open it." "No!" Nyahera's voice rang out, her composure cracking for the first time. She stepped forward, her hands outstretched. "You do not know what you are doing. If you open that box..." "Silence!" Omari barked. "You have held this village hostage with your lies long enough." With a nod, he gave the signal. The lid of the box was pried open with trembling hands. The air seemed to shift as the lid creaked upward, revealing its contents. A collective gasp escaped the villagers as they stepped back, their torches flickering violently. Inside the box lay the skull of Amani, its surface smooth and gleaming, as though carved from moonlight itself. A faint glow emanated from it, casting eerie shadows across the room. Nyahera's shoulders slumped, her expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. She looked at the skull with reverence, as if it carried not just the weight of her family's curse, but the hopes of her entire lineage. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the hut, extinguishing the torches in a single breath. The villagers cried out in fear, clutching each other as darkness enveloped them. And then, a voice spoke. It was deep and resonant, carrying the weight of ages. "Why have you disturbed my rest?" The villagers froze. The voice was unmistakably that of a woman, powerful, yet filled with sorrow. It was the voice of Nyahera's mother. The glow of the skull intensified, illuminating the room with an otherworldly light. The voice continued, its tone heavy with accusation. "You have forgotten the old ways. You have abandoned respect for the ancestors. And now, your greed has brought you to this." The villagers dropped to their knees, their fear palpable. One of the elders spoke, his voice trembling. We did not mean to offend." We were only seeking the truth." "The truth," the voice replied, "is that your suffering is the result of betrayal. Betrayal by one of your own. Nyahera's father took what was sacred, breaking the bond between the living and the ancestors. This box was entrusted to Nyahera to protect you from further harm." Omari stepped forward, his voice defiant despite the trembling in his hands. "This is nonsense. The box is the cause of our misfortune. We must destroy it." "No," Nyahera cried, but her plea was drowned by the rising hum emanating from the skull. The voice turned cold. "Your greed mirrors that of the one who betrayed us. Do you not see the cycle repeating itself?" The hum grew louder, shaking the walls of the hut as the villagers cried out in terror. Omari, consumed by his ambition, lunged forward, reaching for the skull. "I will end this myself," he shouted. As his hands touched the glowing relic, a blinding light erupted from it. Omari screamed, falling back as his hands burned with searing flames. When the light faded, the room fell silent. Omari lay on the ground, clutching his hands, which were now scarred beyond recognition. The villagers stared in horror, their earlier bravado replaced by shame. One by one, they fell to their knees, bowing their heads before the skull. "Forgive us," an elder whispered. "We have forgotten our place." The voice of Nyahera's mother softened, though it still carried an edge of warning. "Respect the old ways and harmony will return, but stray again, and the ancestors' wrath will consume you." Nyahera stepped forward, lifting the skull with trembling hands. "I will take it back to the mountain," she said, her voice weary but resolute. "It belongs where it can harm no one." The villagers watched in silence as Nyahera carried the skull out of the hut, her figure silhouetted against the pale light of the moon. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of finality and peace. The first rays of dawn painted the slopes of Mount Kifaru in hues of gold and crimson, as though the mountain itself carried the blood and light of the ancestors. At its base, the villagers of Ngoma gathered in silence, their faces, once hardened with fear and anger, now reflected remorse and shame. They stood before Nyahera, whose small frame seemed larger than life beneath the towering mountain. Nyahera's voice broke the stillness, calm yet powerful, carrying the wisdom of generations. "You feared what you did not understand," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. "You allowed whispers and greed to poison your hearts, but I do not blame you. Fear is a powerful enemy." Her words struck like thunder, and several villagers lowered their gazes, unable to meet her eyes. "I forgive you," she continued, her tone softening, "not because you deserve it, but because the ancestors teach us that holding anger in our hearts only feeds the fire of destruction. We must learn from this, or the curse will live on, not in objects or rituals, but in our minds." The wind stirred the trees, as if the spirits themselves were listening. An elder stepped forward, his staff trembling in his hands. "We were wrong, Nyahera," he said, his voice breaking. "You have shown us more strength than any of us. Teach us how to rebuild what we have broken." Nyahera nodded, a single tear tracing her cheek. "Together we can restore balance. But first, I must return what was never meant to leave this sacred ground." Nyahera carried the skull of Amani in her arms, its faint glow dimming under the morning light. The villagers followed at a respectful distance, watching as she walked toward the sacred grove at the foot of Mount Kifaru. The grove was ancient, its towering trees entwined with vines that seemed to hum with life. A small clearing lay at its center, where a circle of stones marked the resting place of the ancestors. Kneeling in the center, Nyahera placed the skull gently on the ground. "Great ancestors, she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. I return what was stolen, what brought pain and division to this land. May this offering restore harmony between us. She reached into her pouch and scattered sacred herbs over the skull, whispering words of an ancient prayer taught to her by her mother. As the final word left her lips, the wind, which had been restless, suddenly stilled. The air grew warm, and a single beam of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the skull. The villagers gasped as the skull seemed to melt into the earth, leaving only the faintest impression in the soil. The trees swayed gently, their rustling leaves like a soft murmur of approval. A sense of peace washed over the crowd, and for the first time in years, the villagers felt the curse lift from their shoulders. The elders gathered in the village square later that day, their faces grim as they turned their attention to Omari. His hands were still bandaged from the burns inflicted by the skull, and his once confident posture was now hunched with shame. Omari, the eldest among them began, his voice heavy with sorrow. Your greed and manipulation nearly destroyed this village. For your betrayal of trust and disrespect toward the ancestors, you must leave Ngoma. Omari's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief. Leave? But this is my home. Another elder shook her head. A home is not a place, Omari. It is a bond with those who share it. You broke that bond with your actions. Tears welled in Omari's eyes as he looked around at the villagers. They did not meet his gaze, their silence more painful than any words. Finally he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. I accept your judgment. As he walked away, the path out of the village stretching endlessly before him. The villagers watched in silence. Some pitied him, others felt relief, but all understood the weight of his punishment. His scarred hands would serve as a reminder to all who saw him, a living lesson in the dangers of unchecked ambition. With Omari gone and the curse lifted, the village of Ngoma began to heal. The fields once dry and lifeless were soon tilled with fresh resolve. Villagers worked together, sharing tools and laughter as they planted seeds of maize, millet, and hope. Nyahera walked among them, offering guidance and encouragement. She was no longer an outcast, but a central figure in the community. Her wisdom sought by elders and youth alike. Children followed her to the river, where she taught them the old songs of the ancestors. Women came to her for advice, and men, once wary of her presence, now trusted her judgment. One evening, the villagers gathered in the square to honor the ancestors. Under the light of the full moon, they sang and danced, their voices rising like smoke toward the sacred mountain. An elder stood and raised his hands for silence. Tonight, we celebrate not just the lifting of a curse, but the restoration of our spirit, he said. Let us remember that progress cannot come at the cost of tradition. Nyahera has shown us that wisdom lies in balance, in honoring the past while embracing the future. The villagers nodded, their hearts full of gratitude and resolve. As the celebration continued, Nyahera stood at the edge of the square, watching with a soft smile. For the first time in years, she felt truly at home. In the days that followed, the villagers reflected on the lessons they had learned. They spoke of secrets, once feared, but now understood as sacred burdens that must be handled with care. They spoke of greed and betrayal and how these had nearly torn them apart. But most of all, they spoke of forgiveness and redemption and the power these had to restore harmony. The stories of Nyahera, Omari, and the skull of Amani became part of the village's folklore, passed down to children as a reminder of the importance of respecting the ancestors and each other. As the years went by, Ngoma thrived, its people united by a shared purpose and identity. And though the sacred mountain stood as it always had, silent and watchful, the villagers felt its presence differently now. It was not just a reminder of fate and justice, but a symbol of their resilience and renewal.